Hello, my name is Seth, and I am a customer success engineer with Panoply, here today to give a quick demo of our newest release, the Flex Connector. The purpose of this connector is to provide Panoply users with access to a wide variety of data sources that may not be captured by our Snap connectors, but host data that users would like to see ingested into Panoply. In this video, I will be going over some of the features within the Flex connector, provide an example connection, and address some helpful tips to consider when using this connector. The first thing we'll need to do is create a blank data source in our Panoply account for the Flex connector. We'll also need to identify the API documentation from the source we will be pulling from, which I have here today. We're going to pull currency exchange rate from the Alpha Vantage API. It's important to note that while many platforms have REST APIs that we can utilize, it is possible that a source you are looking to ingest into Panoply does not. So if documentation is not available or cannot be found, we recommend reaching out to the service you are working with to ensure they do in fact have an API available. In addition to the documentation for our example, we can see examples provided for this API call, which can be helpful in establishing the structure of the data prior to ingestion. We recommend testing all desired API calls outside of Panoply before setting up within the Flex connector, using platforms such as Postman to do so. Now, returning to our example, we can see that an example API call is provided here, where the information before the question mark is our base URL, and the information after the question mark represents API parameters, which can also be seen here. Finally, we can see from the Python guide that this will require a GET call. Most documentation will have whether the required call is GET or POST listed very clearly within each API resource. Given all of this information, we can copy the base URL into the Flex connector in Panoply. We will set the method to GET. And finally, we will copy the API parameters into the Flex connector, ensuring that the format follows parameter equals value with ampersand separating any multiple parameters required, which we can see our example already has. Finally, we can see an API key is required. Currently, this is set to demo. However, given that we need to make a specific call, we will replace this with an API key that I previously generated. Authentication requirements are going to vary depending on the data source that is being connected, so you'll need to consult the API documentation for your specific data source in order to generate the proper keys or tokens. For this API, no header information is required, so the last step we need to cover in this section is setting the destination for the data. Based on this API call, we will set our destination to currency underscore exchange underscore rate. At this point, we are able to save the Flex connector. However, there are additional sections that we will go over, demonstrating each section as we go. For pagination, while our example does not require this, it is useful to understand how pagination works, as many APIs require paginating through responses in order to collect all of the data available. When an API contains too much data to display within a single response, the data is oftentimes split by the API provider into multiple pages, which can then be cycled through or paginated through until all of the data is collected. Two types of pagination are currently supported by the Flex connector in Panoply, which are static and dynamic. As an example of static pagination, we can see that the Teachable API allows for a page number to be set as part of an API parameter, in which we can then go from page 1 to page 2 to page 3 and so on, which we can easily configure within the Flex connector. This will then iterate through page 1 with a step of 1 to page 2, 3, and so on. As an example of dynamic pagination, the Recharge API returns a next cursor, which is added as a parameter to the next API call. This means that rather than having a known sequence of inputs like page 1, page 2, etc., we can instead dynamically grab the next cursor value from the API response, append this to the next API call, and thus paginate through the results. These are only two examples of how pagination may work, and you should always consult the specific API documentation to verify which type of pagination, if any, is required for your particular case. The third section of the Flex connector is for refreshing access tokens, as some APIs will have an API key or token that is temporary and upon expiration needs to be refreshed using a different API call. Much of this section requires the same type of information as we went over when setting up the API's base URL, and if required from an API, the information required will be spelled out explicitly within documentation. One important note to make here is that the refresh URL should differ from the base URL. So be sure you are getting the correct URL for this section along with any required parameters, headers, etc. Finally, the last section in the Flex connector is advanced settings. I will not be addressing most of these values in today's video, and instead will point to our documentation, which can be found here. However, I will quickly address the data key entry, as we'll be utilizing this value in our example, and then we'll be all set to collect from this API. The data key represents the path to the data in the response, as the data we are actually interested in is sometimes nested within the API's response. Using our example here, we can see that real-time currency exchange rate is the parent level of data within this response, while the data we are actually interested in is nested below this. Rather than ingest the top level of data that we don't need, we can set the data key to real-time currency exchange rate, which I will do now. This will tell our ingestion engine to pull only data contained within this pathway. Proper setting of the data key can greatly improve the cleanliness of the data ingested into Panoply, and is one of the reasons it is suggested to test API calls outside of Panoply before setting up within the Flex connector, as this will help in clarifying what the data key should be set as. Now that we have configured our Flex connector, we can save and collect data, and we will now have this data from our API soon in our Panoply account. While this runs, I will note that a setup guide for the Flex connector can be found here in our Knowledge Center, along with any release notes that may be helpful as additional features are added to the tool. In addition to this, we can see that all of the other settings available for Snap connectors can be found here as well, including scheduling collections, renaming the connector, and syncing any settings from this connector to another Flex connector. We can see that this is now completed successfully. So we will navigate to our tables and can see that our data is now within Panoply and ready to be used.